Good afternoon. Welcome to the CDP webinar, COVID-19, Place-Based Grantmakers and Investing in Local Communities. This is Sally Ray, Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. This webinar is provided with generous support from Target and is co-sponsored by Interaction, National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, the Council on Foundations, the National Center for Family Philanthropy, Grantmakers in Health, Grantmakers in Aging, United Philanthropy Forum, and the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities. Some reminders before we get started. This webinar is being recorded. It will be available along with recordings from past webinars on our website and YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is complete. And all registrants will be sent a link to the recording. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A box. We'll get to as many as possible at the end of the panel presentation. Questions that are not addressed will be answered in a follow-up document that will be available on this webinar's page on our website. If you are on Twitter, please use hashtag CDP4Recovery to share the discussion. I'd like to share some resources for grantmakers from one of our co-sponsors, the Council on Foundations. You can also submit your fund for inclusion in their list of community foundation response funds for COVID. www.cof.org/COVID-19. You can read their analysis of COVID-19 legislation's impact on philanthropy at www.cof.org/COVID-19 Laws Guide. As some of you may know, COF is asking foundations to sign their pledge. We at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy are proud to announce that we have signed it along with more than 700 other funders. The pledge is a call to action for philanthropy to do their work differently during COVID. This includes agreement to do some or all of the items that are listed on this slide. Understanding that each disaster begins and ends locally, this webinar will explore place-based grant-making and the importance of investing in and strengthening local communities and organizations. The difference between traditional grant-making, generally resolving a specific issue, versus place-based grant-making, addressing issues that impact the community as a whole. The ways in which COVID-19 is upsetting traditional modes of working and delivering services, and how philanthropy needs to respond. The disproportionate impact on vulnerable populations, particularly communities of color, older adults, the unemployed or underemployed, and unhoused or underhoused populations. The ways in which recovering from COVID is going to involve creating a new philanthropic and nonprofit landscape that prioritizes equity, partnership, and collaboration. Now I would like to introduce our guests. Carmen James Randolph is Vice President for Programs at the Greater New Orleans Foundation. As a 22-year veteran of philanthropy, Carmen is an innovator, strategist, expert grantmaker, and collaborative leader committed to the prosperity of communities of color. Maureen Lawless joined the Funders Network in 2002 and currently serves as Vice President and Director of Member Services, organizing membership development, outreach, services, and strategy. She also directs the Philanthropic Preparedness, Resiliency, and Emergency Partnership, PrEP, a community foundation disaster preparedness and response learning cohort in a 10-state Midwestern region. Welcome, and thanks to both of you for taking time away from your work to speak with us today. Maureen, let's start with you. Please define for us place-based grant-making and tell us why it's important.
Sally, can you hear me? This is Maureen.
Yes, Maureen, we can hear you.
You can? Okay, my apologies. The quality on my end is pretty poor, so I'm going to do my best. But if at any point I'm not making sense or tracking along based on what I'm hearing, please just say the word. But first and foremost, this is Maureen Lawless from the Funders Network, and I just wanted to thank our colleagues at CDP so much for having us and for hosting this conversation. And it's always such a privilege to be with Carmen and to learn from her. So I look forward to today's conversation and the opportunity to talk about place-based grant making and why it's so important, particularly in this moment. For the Funders Network, when we think about place-based grant making, we're really looking at how that is able to consider the unique local context, realities, and trends, things like the structural, demographic, economic, environmental, and other types of trends that really are playing out in a local community, in a place, and the particular nuance of that place. Another important element that we consider is that place-based grant making really uses a long-term approach, but with a realistic time frame. It's a recognition that those trends that we just talked about, the structural, demographic, economic, and environmental, are long-term in their nature. And
Maureen, I think we might have lost you on audio. So we'll move now to a question for Carmen. Carmen, how about you? What are the assets and skills that a community foundation brings to the broader philanthropic landscape?
Sure. Community foundations operate on the ground, in community, and benefit from home wisdom, intimate knowledge of community, and a deep commitment to place. In the with the example of the Greater New Orleans Foundation, you will see that we have been active in disaster since Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005, which were truly defining moments which changed our foundation as well as our community forever. And it has been over the last several years that we have been called to put the hard-learned lessons from Katrina and Rita into practice in terms of how we approach disasters and how we help our communities in the short term, in the immediate, as well as over the long term, recover from disasters that our area encounters. So I also want to, I just jumped into answering the question, but I also thank Tanya Gulliver Garcia and all of our colleagues at CDP for having me today. And we're thrilled to be a part of this webinar. So thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. We're glad to have you be a part of it too. I know Ganoff has several pillars or values that it holds dear to help keep its focus and embed its work in community. Could you share those with us and explain why you think they're important for place-based grant making?
Sure. If you advance to the next slide, we have 4 pillars of our disaster grant making strategy, which we developed in about 2017, which truly enabled us to pivot to address this current crisis, the pandemic that we're facing with COVID-19. So those 4 pillars are resilience, looking at how we can make a community stronger than it was before disaster, sustainability. And in terms of sustainability, we are mostly focused on the nonprofit sector. How can we help protect the investments that we've made, the critical services that nonprofits provide to community? How do we protect the nonprofit sector, which we know is a critical part of the fabric of our community beyond the life of the disaster? And then equity, which really centers at our grant making and looking at how we cannot ignore historical inequities and take that into account as we look at the kinds of grant making that we do. And then lastly, looking at the importance of democratic and civic participation. We believe, and this was part of the hard lessons that we learned from Katrina, that communities must be intimately involved with shaping the future of what happens in their communities and having a voice on what their communities look like, or will be like, or how they operate. This should be their vision of their community and how equity and justice play out. That should be at the center of the recovery. So advocacy and policy is a part of what we fund as well.
Thank you, Carmen. Maureen, I think you're back. Community foundations undertake place-based grant making by nature of being local, but why is it important for other types of philanthropy, for example, family, private, corporate funders, to engage in it as well?
Thanks, Sally, and my deepest apologies. I do hope you can hear me now, and I'm so sorry about the trouble I was having with my audio. We'll chalk it up to 2 adults working from home and 2 children on online school, but thank you for your patience, and I hope this quality is better now. So you're right, and TFN works so much with community foundations who are focused on place-based grant making, but there are plenty of other types of philanthropy who can engage in it as well, often working in partnership with community or other place-based funders in a region. Some of what we think really makes that type of partnership important and unique, and things to keep in mind when looking at partnering and working with others on place-based grant making are things like the opportunity to develop partners and relationships, not just funders, but the community nonprofits as well. For those who may be coming at this, for funders who may be coming at this from a national or regional perspective, that working in partnership in place-based grant making really offers an opportunity to inform practice, to seed ideas, test concepts, facilitate learning, kind of working at a scale that allows one to see what works, what doesn't work, and what could potentially be extrapolated to other contexts as well. That place-based grant making really offers another opportunity for impact and measurement. Again, looking at that scale and being able to truly kind of try to get the best sense possible on what works and what can be measured and measured effectively. Going back to some of what I would have talked about at the beginning, is that working in place, again, offers that opportunity for addressing systemic structural issues and outcomes, and that anyone who is willing to listen, learn, and adapt is going to be well served by thinking about focusing on place and the place-based grant making.
You suggest that national and regional funders should work with local funders. How do you think they should go about that? And then also, how do you think local funders should engage with their regional or national counterparts?
So starting first with thinking about regional and national funders working in partnership with community and place-based funders, it's first about identifying and understanding the context. So really trying to look out at the landscape of who's working in the region. And often by identifying those community and place-based funders, you have the opportunity to get to know and discuss the local context even further. So identifying and understanding, working with those funders, who the nonprofit community and grassroots leaders are, and surfacing those types of relationship development opportunities, thinking about and understanding what approaches to community engagement are already at work in that place, and what may be working, and what might offer opportunities for perhaps innovation or other efforts. Again, understanding the root challenges of the place, working with the place-based funders and the nonprofit community and grassroots leaders on what are the system structures and needs. And again, really trying to, through those conversations, understand what's worked and what. thinking about the reverse and how place-based and local funders could engage with their regional or national counterparts, I think it's very much thinking about what is the particular type of intervention or issue or outcome you're seeking to address, who's working in that space, understanding how, if at all, they've partnered or worked with place-based funders in the past, and having an opportunity to present kind of the context of what engaging in place-based grant making, perhaps in partnership with a local or place-based community foundation, could help that funder learn, test, understand, and be able to extrapolate potentially to their broader outcomes and objectives as well.
Carmen, building on that, I think one of the fears for some national funders is not knowing how to find and vet local organizations. For CDP, that also means finding the groups working with the most vulnerable folks who may not have the resources to do fund development and communications. What do you do to help identify the grassroots and local organizations in your community?
Well, one thing that we do is that we're clear that we cannot do this alone. And I don't think any one philanthropic entity can address a disaster in isolation. This is a perfect opportunity for us to work together, for us to learn from one another, and to be strategic together. So I would say how we get a sense of what's happening on the ground and identifying those nonprofits is, first, we've made a commitment to be proactive versus reactive, which is a real incredible mind shift for a philanthropic organization, meaning we are accepting that we're going to be in action during a disaster, not if one occurs, but when one occurs, knowing that, and especially with our position being in New Orleans, where we have the challenges of sea level rise and as well as subsidence, our land is sinking, and we're prone to situational flooding as well as hurricanes. It isn't a question of if, it's a question of when. So how we change our organization to adapt to the reality that we're going to be called into action, and it's better to be prepared and to set our systems up so that we are prepared in advance. And by doing so, we engage in strategic communication with our local governments, with the city of New Orleans, with surrounding parish presidents. We also engage with nonprofits, those who would typically be involved in a disaster, those VOADs, as well as community organizations that are important anchor entities in the community, and philanthropy. So we have made our disaster fund an evergreen fund. Our donors can contribute to that fund year round. We have engaged in donor education to educate them about the importance of having dollars pre-positioned in that fund so that we're ready to go when a disaster occurs. So in the case of COVID-19, we had more than $60,000 in our fund that donors had contributed over the last year that we were able to make grants immediately once a state of emergency was declared. And we were able to do that because we talked to nonprofits early. We learned the landscape. We understand who is working on the ground, who's positioned to, for instance, collect data, mine 211 calls, and direct resources, knowing how our suppliers of food are doing, what the network is around supplying food, and considering who those critical safety net partners are, including legal services. And then what we do is we pre-register organizations to receive funding. So we pre-register them through our electronic grant-making portal, where they are signing in, they're creating an account, They're uploading their financial information. They're telling us about their boards and what they're doing and how they typically would respond in a disaster. And ironically, we have these groups update this information usually in the first quarter of the year. And when COVID-19 had happened, we already had about 25 organizations that were pre-registered and in our system. But given this isn't a storm, this wasn't a tornado, so all of those groups were not necessarily the right ones to respond to this particular disaster. So we had to think a little bit broadly. And even though all 25 were not positioned to respond, several of them were. And several of them were actually converting their services or making adjustments. And we were able to make grants within 36 hours to at least 2 nonprofits that were pre-registered. And then the other 2, we looked at senior services organizations in Orleans and in Jefferson Parish. And for them, it was a pretty speedy process of getting them in our system and being able to support them electronically. And then we also focus on organizations who are serving the most vulnerable populations and ensure that leaders of color are engaged and supported. So it isn't just enough to say we're going to focus on vulnerable communities and only support organizations that are mainstream organizations, but also make sure that we have organizations that are represented by leadership that understands the communities in which they're serving pretty intimately. So we also take careful attention to make sure that our disaster portfolio is grounded and has a balance of leaders of color that are getting resources and are supported through those efforts.
Very impressive, Carmen. CDP has partnered with the Funders Network for several years on the Philanthropic, Preparedness, Resiliency, and Emergency Partnership Program, PREP for short. The goal is to create and support a community foundation disaster preparedness and response learning cohort in a 10-state Midwestern region of the United States that flanks the Mississippi and Missouri River watershed. Maureen, how and why should grantmakers collaborate for learning and granting? And what would you say are the first few steps to beginning a partnership or collaboration?
Sure. As I answer those questions, I also just want to underscore so much of what Carmen just said. So much of what she just shared is reflected in what the community foundations who participate in PREP do and what we talk about. And right now that includes just over community foundations. And so being able to take some of those principles that Carmen just shared about thinking about the criteria for setting up your disaster fund and screens you would use to activate it, and then conditions under which you would be working with nonprofit partners and pre-positioning, pre-qualifying those nonprofit partners to be able to move. Those are some of the core elements we've been able to work on together collectively and collaboratively across 20 community foundations, so that hopefully across this region, there are at least that number who are ready to go, as we say, when disaster strikes versus if. So I just want to thank you again, Carmen, for that work and underscore it, because I think it's just right on. But we really have seen that there is tremendous benefit in this case to these place-based and community foundations coming together for shared learning, and in some cases shared granting. In particular, what we were able to do in this case is identify some of the shared characteristics that we think would be beneficial for community foundations in this case to come together and work together. So they're working in similar geographies. Every community is unique and has its own characteristics, but working across this particular region, these communities can kind of see themselves in one another and have that kind of shared experience that sometimes makes it a little bit easier to think about how what's happening in one place may translate to what you might be wanting to accomplish in your place. So it was that kind of shared geography and recognition of that shared geography, and then also a recognition that this is a region of the where it truly is a matter of when, not if, a natural disaster will likely strike. So it's Tornado Alley, and it's, you know, plenty of flooding given the proximity to these rivers and these watersheds. So a number of the participants had already been through disasters and were willing to come and share their experience and continue to learn from it. And then there were a number who knew it was just this question of when, not if, and taking advantage of an opportunity to work together in order to position themselves, their communities, the nonprofits with whom they work, to hopefully be ready to act, to respond, and more than anything, to prepare for these circumstances. So I think fundamentally, it's about finding those shared values, characteristics, needs that would be beneficial in kind of a group or a cohort context. And for us, in addition to identifying and understanding those potential needs at the beginning of the partnership, or in order to start the partnership, we did a lot of research, not only understanding the funding landscape and the players, but also the history of storms in the region and or other natural disasters, and what type of frequency some of these places were looking at. So again, we could really be trying to narrow in and hone in on what might deliver the most value for a collective learning experience. And I think the final thing I'll say just on this point is that it's been really remarkable to watch the network that these folks have become to one another, particularly on issues of disasters and disaster grant making, but also on other issues that they share by being community foundations and by being community foundations who are operating in similar types of communities that are facing similar types of challenges. And so I think we've seen the most value in kind of really understanding what those shared characteristics are that might bring people to the table.
Thank you, Maureen. Carmen, similarly, Ganoff is one of the leaders of the Greater New Orleans Funders Network, which aims to inspire and optimize philanthropic investment in the Greater New Orleans region to promote equity and increase justice. What strategies and first steps would you suggest for building a collaboration?
Sorry, I was on mute. Well, I will first like to underscore what Maureen was saying. True for the Greater New Orleans Funders Network, as well as other work that we've done, finding those shared values with philanthropic partners is a critical first step. Being clear on what is important, and then how it isn't just only what are our values, but then how do we put those values into action? How do we use action to drive our values? And if we value equity, what does that look like in terms of our strategies for what it is we're investing in and how we work together? So what I've illustrated on this slide is, going back to that earlier point of understanding that we can't do this work alone. We've reached out to other place-based funders and community foundations that were also in areas that were vulnerable to floods, to flooding. And we did some research to look at what flood loss looked like in several communities along different coastlines in Florida, Texas, even as far as Rhode Island and Virginia, and started and began a conversation about what does disaster recovery or equitable disaster recovery look like in your communities? What would you like it to look like? And how can we do this work better And what kind of exchange or learning could we have from working together? So in 2018, we started an initiative called When Waters Rise. We're not a formal network. We've come together loosely as just a learning community over the last 2 years, and invite others to just learn with us, and have come together so that we can learn and share best practices from one another. Like when I was talking about being proactive versus reactive was a real shift for our community foundation. I suspect that there are ways that COVID-19 will forever change all of us in terms of how we operate and how philanthropy responds. And this is true too for how we look at how doing this kind of philanthropy can change an organization. So like, for instance, through this network, we ask those hard questions of, well, how do you approach disaster philanthropy when it is that you need to respond to a situation and charge fees, whether it's to donors, individual donors, or it's to institutional donors? And then what does that fee even look like? And we had the benefit of learning from our colleagues in Houston after I cannot remember the hurricane. I think it was, goodness, it just went out of my head. Anyway, the hurricane that impacted Houston not long ago, and they found that they raised incredible amounts of money with thank you, Harvey. After Hurricane Harvey, they raised incredible amounts of money without, with a promise that they weren't going to charge any fees. And at the end of the day, that ended up causing serious, serious harm to the foundation because they had to hire more folks. It just was of tremendous cost to actually process all of those grants and to do that level of work. So how do you do this in a way that helps you operate? And then also learning from our colleagues at Center for Disaster Philanthropy that so much of the funds that are either raised publicly or that are generated publicly or from private sources goes out the door immediately. And donors have, and individual donors have that need. I want to know where my money is going, and I want you to show me immediately the impact it's having. So often community foundations are under pressure to put the money out the door as quickly as possible. However, living in these communities, we know that recovery takes time. And it is in those months and it's in those weeks and months after a storm or a tornado or a disaster hits that the money starts to dry up, but yet the need is ever increasing. So how do we balance the dollars that we raise so that we're putting out money immediately, but we're also holding dollars back for longer term support? So it's been a place to identify those shared values and then to talk about and learn from each other about how do we put these values into action and what changes does that mean for our foundation. And what we found is that those changes, it isn't just with your program officers and your grant making team, it's with your donor relations team, it's with your finance team. You know, we weren't making electronic grants before all of this. And thank goodness we had made that shift. Now, given all of our grants were not electronic, and in this COVID-19 reality, my poor colleague who is our VP of Finance has been driving between 3 staff members' homes to get checks signed. We understand that's not really a sustainable way of us operating. So, but we at least had laid the groundwork to start electronic grant making and get those systems in place. So there are a lot of changes in systems that need to happen to make your values actionable. And I think that is part of what you can learn and we can learn as funders as we talk and exchange and learn from each other in a way that's safe, that's truthful, and just puts it out there, because these changes, These are changes that, you know, take time and aren't always the most easy to make.
Thank you, Carmen. Now we're going to turn to some audience questions. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit it, and we'll try to get as many as we can. I want to start with this one, though. The challenge with COVID is that the phases of disaster, preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery, they're all occurring at the same time. And while they're interrelated, they require a little bit different approach. So how can we approach and balance the different phases of disaster recovery? And what funding sources are there for this? Carmen, I think that probably should go to you first.
I can say yes to that question. Here. All of those phases have been coming together, and this situation has been ever changing from day one. I don't know if it was Center for Disaster Philanthropy that held one of the very first webinars. It was before a disaster was officially declared here in Louisiana. But one of the speakers said that the hallmark of this virus, coronavirus, is going to be uncertainty. And I wrote that down, and I tell you, I go back to that weekly, because the uncertainty piece has played out time and time again. But in terms of the preparedness piece, I can tell you one of the things that we did to try to help our nonprofits be ready for disaster is we held a disaster summit over a year ago to help nonprofits learn how to put together their continuance of operations plans. And when we announced that summit, we had about 77 nonprofits sign up for it, and less than 10% of them had COOP plans already in place. So going into COVID-19, we already knew so many of our nonprofits in our region were not prepared. They were not prepared for a storm, let alone for a pandemic. So one of the things that we did in the first stages is we started doing informational and training webinars for nonprofits on everything from pulling together local and national experts on social distancing, on the virus and the disease of COVID-19 itself, on crisis communications, on financial planning. We offered support for nonprofits with developing their applications for the PPP loan. A whole set. We've hosted probably about 16 of these webinars since this crisis began. We've had more than 2,000 folks participate in these webinars. And then we've also have surveyed our nonprofit sector. We've surveyed about 734 nonprofits with a response rate of about 43% to understand what they're going through. So I think that being in touch with nonprofits, providing training and support, getting feedback, understanding what exactly is the reality of those nonprofits on the ground, as well as doing the reconnaissance and talking to our partners about where the needs are, so that you can do grant making that is responsive to the need in the moment, but understanding that those needs are going to shift. They're going to shift, they're going to expand, they're going to grow, and they're going to change. So we have made about $1.6 million in grants over the last 8 weeks. It's just been phenomenal. And I can tell you that each of those rounds have looked different and have responded to the specific needs. Like, for instance, we started funding homeless, elderly, and wage workers, nonprofits that were supporting those populations. We later did a grant round focused on addressing the disparities in health, as we started to understand that COVID-19 was affecting 60% of deaths of COVID-19 in Louisiana were African Americans. Then we started looking at the disparities in healthcare that were longstanding in our community, and going to the root of how we can help increase more access and equity for telemedicine, for mental health services. So I would say that having a strategy that's flexible, that's fluid, and that addresses the needs as they develop is probably a good step. And then in this next round that we're about to make, we're focused on even more vulnerable communities, opportunity youth. We know those numbers are growing, undocumented as well as immigrants, and ex-offenders and returning citizens, seeing how what those supports are looking like, as well as for youth who are in detention facilities. So I think having a strategy that's flexible and fluid, as well as that just moves with as this disaster unfolds.
Thanks, Carmen. And Maureen, probably what would we're seeing in this case that there's a significant amount of effect on existing nonprofits who may not traditionally be disaster focused. And we may see some extinction, some of those nonprofit organizations actually cease to exist as a result of the effects of this pandemic. How are you encouraging your funders to take a look at those local organizations who may not be their typical disaster responding organizations, but balancing that need to support local organizations in their existence, their continuing vitality, while also supporting the recovery process?
Right. Well, you're right. There's no question that philanthropy and the nonprofit sector are being called to respond here in ways we probably seen before, with the size, the scope, and the overarching impacts. We know that everyone is impacted one way or another, but that certainly what COVID is doing is kind of highlighting some of these really deep-rooted structural inequities that have been persistent in communities, and that this just is shining an even brighter light on it. But given all of that, the nonprofit actors are being called to do more and different, even if they weren't ever, frontline disaster organizations. It's thinking about the ongoing needs that those organizations attend to on a regular basis, be they education or health or other issues. And we've been very much kind of supportive of these calls in the sector, similar to the one that you were describing at the outset of the call that the Council on Foundations is doing, and just encouraging funders to be in regular communication with their existing grantees, to understand what their needs and their challenges are, to be as flexible as possible with those existing grantees in order to hopefully be able to allow them to kind of deploy the support that they have to the highest and best use in this moment, and to really that flexibility and that ongoing communication, I think, is really paramount right now. And those are some of the things that we're trying to be really clear about. The uncertainty of the moment is the challenge for all of us. And I certainly don't pretend to have answers to any of that, but I do want to underscore Carmen's point about kind of the flexibility. One thing we've often talked about with the grantmakers we work with in disaster spaces is that trying to be as clear as possible about what your priorities are and communicating those as clearly as possibly with your donors. So we work with a number of community foundations who see their role as being its highest and best use in mid and long-term recovery. Again, recognizing that COVID is a unique circumstance here, and all of what we've learned from prior disasters, may not be perfectly applicable here. But if that's a lane that you choose for a variety of reasons, just being really clear in your communication with not only your donors, but your grantees, that's the area of investment is really important. But but these are such unique circumstances that even if you've already said in the past that, you know, mid to long-term recovery is your lane, the uniqueness of what we're dealing with here may require you to be flexible and make some adjustments that you wouldn't have done previously.
We're discovering that here at CDP with our COVID response fund as well. And while our webinars focus on philanthropy, I know we have a lot of NGOs joining us today, and we've had this question. Carmen, I'd probably throw it to you, I believe. How can local organizations who are providing COVID-19 relief get information out to potential donors? How can they reach potential funders if they may not already be on the radar screen?
Here I will say, I think the best thing to do is to reach out. We do not know everything that is happening in community, and certainly want to know. So don't assume that because a funder has never funded you before, that they would not be open to funding you before. We've had some nonprofits reach out to us that are doing some very creative work in community, everything from operating a diaper bank to young people in the lower 9 who have come together to get fresh foods and meals to seniors in their communities. These were groups that were not on our radar screen before, but they've reached out. So reach out to your local philanthropic community foundation and your partners, and let them know what you're doing. Let them know what the need is as you see it on the ground, and you know, be very clear, and also make that case. Speaking more as a fundraiser than a program officer or a foundation person, I would also say if you have been declined from a foundation in the past, don't take that no as a permanent no. They may not have had the resources to support you at the time, but saw that you were doing great work. So go back to those folks who may have declined you in the past. Go back to those foundations who you are currently in partnership with, and also reach out to those who you have not had relationships with yet.
Exactly, Carmen. I would say that we agree with you here at CDP that we've talked with over 120 different organizations, funded several of them, and always want to know what work is going on in the communities, even if you don't feel, even if it doesn't end up that it's an organization we can fund because it doesn't meet the needs of our fund, but we want to know what's going on. We want to know that you're doing that work. So reach out and let us know what's going on. I think that's the communication is key when you're looking for funding. Another question we have here is, how do we make sure that we aren't conflicting with government funding? How do we balance to that need to get dollars out the door and working quickly with the slower moving government funds that we know might address the same issues later? Do we try to solve different problems, or do we try to solve problems quickly with hopes that the government will go elsewhere? How would you suggest they do that, Carmen?
And this is coming more from a philanthropic organization?
Yes, it's a funder who's asking that question.
Well, I would say that philanthropy is in a very unique position to encourage and also to move faster than government and motivate government. Like in the case of us supporting the federally qualified health centers, the FQHCs in our community, and giving them substantial dollars so that they could use those and put them in a position to lead, to expand their telehealth practices. It really put them in a position with our local government to say, you know, we have the capacity to expand what we're doing in terms of telehealth, where we have the capacity to offer more mental health services, where we're seeing a definite increase. And with your support, we can do increased testing. So it has helped with them move and be positioned as leaders to now work with government in another way. So I would say, don't hold back those dollars thinking, well, the government should be supporting that. Sometimes you can help position nonprofits to be in a leadership position by making those grants of private support. It helps give them more leverage with their local community.
And stay tuned for our next webinar, which will cover some of that topic for you, how the CARES Act does and doesn't cover, and how the role of philanthropy can fill gaps in advocating for more support for that. We'll dive a bit deeper then. The next question is, Carmen, again, I apologize. We're kind of feeding you an awful lot of questions. Is your communications with the government and VOAD structured? In other words, do you participate in their field offices and EOCs, or is it unstructured, more of a one-on-one type communication as needed?
Well, it's been a bit of both. We have actually, there wasn't a formal VOAD here in New Orleans, and we have been working with the city of New Orleans and pulling together regional, like informal VOAD organizations over the last year. We've worked with our city's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness to do tabletop exercises with nonprofits in terms of how they would respond. So in several ways, it's been formal through in partnership with particularly the city of New Orleans. So we are partners and co-hosts of a weekly call for nonprofit leaders that have been happening since this disaster occurred. But also very informal, because our program officers are, they make themselves available, they have those conversations with folks, they call, they check in, they see how the work is going. And for some of the grants that we've made in the past, we've streamlined, for instance, the reporting process, where the report happens via an interview, and folks are interviewed, they answer those questions, we send back those interviews, they sign off on them, and that serves as a final report. So I would say informally and formally, we've arranged ways to keep those lines of communication open, directly with the nonprofit and also in partnership with the city.
Thanks, Carmen.
Sally, could I add to that quickly?
Sure, absolutely.
Just to say, from the kind of the relationships and participation of funders with COADs and VOADs in particular, this is something we've seen happen quite frequently with the community foundations we work with within the PrEP cohort. If they weren't already actively participating in their COAD or VOAD, if it was in existence, many of them have begun to, and in some cases, some are even, chairing committees or chairing the COAD or VOAD for a period of time. And it goes back to that, that philosophy of the relationship development for disasters often works well in blue skies. And if you can understand the landscape and begin participating with the COAD and VOAD, if that makes sense for your organization, it provides such a great hands-on way to get to know the landscape and what's happening. And so just, again, recognizing that this particular circumstance is unique in terms of COVID-19, but if you have a COAD or VOAD in your community, that as a funder participating in those, getting to know the landscape better and having those lines of communication, we've seen there be tremendous value from that.
And Maureen, another question for you. From how can a locally based funder encourage national funders and other resources to come into their state or their local community? How can they work to make that happen? And is there a strong role for them to play in doing that?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, you are closest to, you know, you're, as a place-based funder, you're closest to the on-the-ground issues and trying to draw attention to those so that if they need to be resourced beyond what the local community has the capacity to do, you know, that can be such a valuable role for the funders beyond your own grant making, the ability to leverage other resources to tell the story. I think it continues to go back to thinking about where there is alignment with the needs and issues you're seeing community that require attention, and where there are those areas of investment among regional and national funders. And so if you can find that alignment and make that kind of case, I think that's the, you know, one of the strategies to pursue is just who's already working in this space. And as Carmen said, you know, so many are working, and we're working in this new environment now that even if we didn't have pre-existing relationships, trying to find who's working in that space and how you could effectively share the story toward a goal of, you know, potentially being able to leverage attention and investment would be my first thought.
Thanks for that, Maureen. As we begin to wrap up, I'd like to summarize some of the discussion and provide the audience with some key takeaways from our conversation. One size does not fit all. What works in one community might not work in another, and by listening to local leaders, philanthropy can learn what is needed in this place during this disaster. Begin by getting to know the community's leadership. Community leaders may need a new set of skills to manage their recovery, but they can bring in the key players and the strengths of that community. It's important to grant quick dollars for community development work. Disasters shine a light on all the town's vulnerabilities. If affordable housing was an issue before, it is more profound after. Investing in recovery services is an opportunity to do things differently and maybe better. Stay for the long haul. Disasters are not over when the first responders, major NGOs, or external philanthropy leaves. Disasters are over when the community is returned to some state of recovery and their new normal, whatever that might be. Collaborate and build coalitions. Some of the best work in disaster recovery and philanthropy in general stems from collaborative philanthropy and partnerships. Together, we are stronger. Inequity can be reduced by a focus on place. Those who are most vulnerable before a disaster are also most vulnerable after the disaster. Viewing recovery through an equity lens is critical and is done best in conjunction with a focus on place. As our panelists have shared, there will be ongoing needs to assist with recovery efforts over an uncertain length of time. CDP and its partners at Candid are tracking philanthropic donations to this outbreak. As of May 11th, the total donations received stood at over $10.4 billion. Quoting from Candid's most recent blog, they say, within that amount, Candid has identified 639 COVID-19 related funds established by 594 foundations. Many of those funds, 67% of which are hosted by community foundations, have already made several rounds of disbursements. The first $83 million in disbursements focused on health, human services, public safety, education, and community and economic development. They add, numerous sources report the pandemic is disproportionately affecting minority communities. Candid's data indicate that only 0.1% of COVID-19 funding and only 2.2% of grants indicate an explicit focus on these populations. CDP has many resources devoted to disaster philanthropy that can assist you, including our COVID-19 response fund, and our staff is always available to provide guidance. You can find more information about our work at www.disasterphilanthropy.org. To those of you who may be planning disaster response funding, CDP has additional information in our Disaster Philanthropy Playbook. You can find this resource at disasterplaybook.org. This webinar is part of a series of webinars taking place the second and fourth Tuesday of each month at 2 p.m. Eastern through July 14th. The next one, as I mentioned earlier, is on May 26th, and the topic will be COVID-19, how philanthropy can stand up for vulnerable populations. And we're also looking at the CARES Act in that and how it doesn't cover, what it doesn't cover, and how philanthropy can step in to fill those gaps. In order to respect everyone's time and keep this to an hour, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today's webinar. Thank you so much to Carmen and Maureen for taking time to share their insights. Special thanks again to Target for sponsoring this webinar, and to our co-sponsors, Interaction, National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, Council on Foundations, the National Center for Family Philanthropy, Grantmakers in Health, Grantmakers in Aging, United Philanthropy Forum, and the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. As the webinar ends, a brief survey will pop up. Please take a moment and share your thoughts. And if you have questions that were not addressed during today's webinar, you may email them to me at sally.ray@disasterphilanthropy.org. Thank you, stay healthy, and have a good afternoon.